This is The Crossover.
Now, very pleased to welcome an SI legend and good friend, Jack McCallum. Jack, how are you, sir? Thanks for coming in.
I'm doing okay, Howard. How are you?
I'm doing well. So I've already laid this out for the listeners, what we're going to do today. But before we begin, a quick caveat for both of us and the listeners. So we're going to get into our 75th anniversary ballots here, but out of respect for the process and not to give away too much, because the league's not announcing the results of this for a few weeks, not that your ballot and mine are the only thing, but we'll mention all the obvious or some of the obvious guys that we're adding or that we're putting on this list. But it'd be wrong to unveil our full ballots now. Also impractical for two of us to go through 75 names in a podcast. Might lose a few listeners along the way. So the results are going to come out around opening night, I'm told. So everybody will learn the results soon enough. There are, I don't know how many other people voting. But in any case, out of respect for the process, we're not going to name our entire ballots, but we'll discuss some of the thought process, try to tackle some of the quandaries along the way. And we'll just go from there. So let me start with this question, Jack, because this is your second time doing this. You did the 50th anniversary list. You were a voter back in '96.
And I'm still alive. And I'm still alive.
Still, I was looking over the list of voters from back then. The few of them we've lost along the way, unfortunately. So I just hope I'm around to do the top 100 in 25 years.
You will be.
I'm going to be on a mountaintop somewhere, Jack. No one's going to find me in 25 years. I'm just going to be out of forget it. All right. So, philosophical question to frame this from the top, which is this. When we talk about the 75th anniversary list, 75 players for the NBA's first 75 years. Is it the greatest 75 players? Like, these are the best 75 to ever play the game in the NBA? Or is it 75 players who represented the best of their individual eras and the totality of the league? In other words, is it just about the skill set and how great they are at playing the game? Or is this more of a historical kind of posterity exercise where we just want to recognize all of these eras? Because there are different ways of going about this. And I thought it was interesting that our friend Rick Bucher on his podcast has been doing this as an exercise where he says, I'm breaking it into 15-year segments so that we can respect every era. And I'm not sure. So what is it? Best 75, or is this more of a posterity exercise?
Well, I guess I kind of, just to bail out on the question, I guess I kind of fall in between. The big question we had here, Howard, was, which kind of speaks to your question, do we just go to the 75 list and copy the 50 that we had elected back in 1996? Do we just automatically put it down? My first answer to that, because I remember I was talking to another, guy from my era. I won't reveal what he said exactly, but Dave Dupree, who was my great friend from back in the day, Dave goes, you can't kick somebody off. You can't kick. He can't have made the team and then you kick his ass off. And I said yes to that. And then I said no. And I ended up kicking, making a few kickings to make room for new guys. And I guess my particular, I'm not going to say bias, but my particular thought process was that I'm an old guy covered the league in the 80s. And I really want to shade this so fans that are coming, I'm not doing it for the fans, but I didn't want to have all old names on there. And if it came to me a choice between some immortal who helped make the league in the 1950s, like, not Bill Russell, of course, and then a guy who I'm wondering about now, even if he wasn't a legendary aughts player, I maybe gave a little break to that. So there's some degree of modernism in this thing, but I don't want to go too far on that. Of course I have Bill Russell. Of course I have, Wilt Chamberlain. Of course I have Jerry West, Elgin Baylor, Oscar Robertson. But if it came to a sort of a close thing, I kind of maybe thought I should go more modern. Yeah. If that helps answer the question. But
No. It does to an extent because these things are all tied together. I mean, one of the questions I've been asking other friends in the business whose opinions I value is, should we consider the 50th anniversary list sacrosanct? Are those 50 a permanent 50 and you can only add to them? Like, how seriously should we take it? And one of the things, Jack, that I've struggled with, aside from just how dramatically this game and this league change from decade to decade, to say nothing over the course of 75 years, it's also that simple math question, right? Even if those 50 were universally agreed on as the best 50 of the first 50 years, when you have another 25 years pass, to say that there could only be 25 players in 25 years that were better than any of the people in that 50 list just defies all logic. Like, if you hit some golden age of the sport, and let's face it, because of training and specialization and all these advances we have, there are more great players now. I just think there are. And if you have 40 guys who are all-timers over 25 years, just to throw out one possible number, it necessarily implies that you have to knock off some of the guys from the original 50. The other thing that I've decided in my own mind, Jack, to make me feel a little better about potentially throwing guys off from the original 50 is this. That was the greatest 50 list. It exists still. When we have the 75th anniversary team come out, it doesn't negate the 50. Like, if you were on the 50th the all-time 50 greatest players list, you will always still be on that list.
Right.
That you
That's
didn't make the 75 doesn't.
I was on
right?
the top 50. Yeah, that's your grandkids.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I use
perpetuity.
I use the Pluto. Every time somebody doesn't want to change something, I use the Pluto argument. They decided Pluto wasn't a planet. I loved Pluto when I was in school. It was a Disney character, had nothing to do with the planet. But the Confederate statues. Okay, back in 1900, that's
a whole other thing.
We'll put this jackass up in the town square, but now we're going to take him down. I mean, things have to change a little bit, and if they can take Pluto away from being a planet, we can take somebody off the top 50 list. That's my Pluto argument I use for things.
I've got a few Pluto candidates from that original 50. I will not compare them to Confederate soldiers. However, that might be a step too far. Poor Pluto. I liked Pluto too. It was small, it was cute, it was distant, Now it's
and you remember the name.
Planet.
You remember the name all the time. Neptune was hard, but Pluto was right there. Anyway.
Pluto was easy. Yeah, it's a fun name. All right, so we're in agreement. We could as necessary toss guys off. I also want to note this about the original 50, just to get a little historical perspective, especially for younger listeners who maybe have not scrolled this far back on Basketball Reference. But the NBA starts off in 1946 as the BAA, the Basketball Association of America. There are 11 teams in 1946. There's only 8 teams the next year. Then it goes up to 12, then 17, then back down to 10, then 9, then 8. There's 8 in the 55-56 season. And so in the 1960s, this era of Bill Russell and those great Boston Celtics teams, and the Celtics winning 8 championships in a row and 11 overall with Bill Russell, there's 8 teams to start in the 1960s. Eventually gets to 14 by the end. There's only 2 rounds of playoffs to get to the finals. It's not to diminish any of the achievements, because every player and every team's greatness is trapped in the context of its own era. You were the most dominant team of that era. You deserve the accolades that come with that. But it's a much different place. When the Celtics won their 9th of those 11 titles in 1966, there were still only 9 teams. There were 12 teams in 67, 14 teams in 1968. Also, there were no black players in the NBA, or the BAA, the predecessor, until 1950. So 4 years into the league's history. And even then, there was a belief among black players then that there was a 4-man quota per team, that you weren't going to have more than 4 black players on a team. So you also didn't have a fully integrated, fully, staffed up, for lack of a better term, league. Not all the best talent was there. And I haven't done the math on this, Jack, but I mean, the percentage of white players who made the top 50 team, it's pretty high, especially from that 1946 to, say, 1960s group up to 1970. So it's necessarily skewed, and I think we should recognize that when we're reassessing every 25 years or so.
Sure.
I think that's only fair.
That comes up in baseball that Babe Ruth, of his singular achievements, he did not, he didn't play against any African American players. At the same time, I totally agree with you. There is an argument also that, for example, let's take Bob Cousy. If any of our young viewers, any of your young fans would watch old films of Coos coming up and doing his dribbling thing, kind of, and looking like he couldn't get by anybody. And we get into this argument of, oh my God, Bob Cousy's he can't guard. Let's take Steph Curry on an isolation and Bob Cousy. You're going to say, what is Cousy doing on this list? And some of those guys from early guys have to be there, that some of their achievements is based on making this league what it was, that they are the revolutionaries. They are the guys that did it first. Never mind if you can't exactly imagine their skill set transferring over, that, there's a lot of guys like that from the first list. Most of them happen to be white, because if you were a black player back then, you had to be so good. The four best first dominant players were Russell, Chamberlain, Baylor. I mean, who the hell is going to argue, with that? And that's all like from 1950 to 1960. Cousy, Dolph Shays, some of the names that would, Bob Pettit. These were great, great players in their era, and they helped make the league. And for that reason, I wouldn't think of taking some of those guys off the top 50. Yeah.
And as I say, listen, if I bumped any of them, I'm still going to come back to, as part of my defense for angering the basketball gods or the historians who so value that first early part of the NBA, I'm just going to say, listen, they are still among the top 50 of the first 50 years. And I do think, like with anything else, your impact diminishes over time. Your place in the game diminishes over time. Some of these guys retired as top 10 all-time scorers, and now they might be 40th because a bunch of guys leapfrogged them in the decades that just happens. That's how history goes. It's, so I won't feel entirely bad about it. I'll just note this. So there are 19 players on the original 50 who played, or whose primes, their primary careers, they began their careers or in their best years, were in that 1946 to 1970 segment, which is like very much the early days of the NBA, and still not completely integrated everything else. 19 players in the top 50 were from that earliest era. That's George Mikan, Bob Cousy, Bob Pettit, Dolph Shays, Bill Russell, Bill Sharman, Elgin Baylor, Arizin, Wilt, Jerry Lucas, Oscar, Jerry West, Hal Greer, Willis Reed, DeBusschere, Havlicek, Sam Jones, Nate Thurman, Billy Cunningham. And so that group, you can see a lot of why they got there. Not just their individual excellence, but all of those guys, except for Elgin Baylor, had championships when they retired. And so championships figure really a lot in this. I looked at also just in the entire top 50, the 50th anniversary list, only 9 guys made that who did not win rings. And that was Baylor, Nate Thurmond, Pete Maravich, Dave Bing, George Gervin, Charles Barkley, Patrick Ewing, Stockton, and Malone. Only one MVP, only one guy who had won an MVP during the first 50 years didn't make the top 50. That was Bob McAdoo. So MVP feels like almost an automatic election unless you're Bob McAdoo. So let's get to Bob McAdoo for a second, because
one of the guys I'm wrestling with.
Yeah. He got snubbed in 1996. My good friend Mark Stein has never forgiven you and the rest of that voting panel for leaving off one of his childhood heroes. And there's a really strong case for McAdoo to make it, but that's now you're trying to add McAdoo and 25 guys from the new era and not necessarily knock off too many guys. Did you? Let me just ask in general, again, without giving away your 75 ballot. Do you have any regrets, misgivings looking back about who got left off? For all I know, you might have voted for McAdoo and been outvoted in 1996. But between McAdoo and Adrian Dantley, Dominique, those are 3 guys that were considered snubs back then, Dominique in particular. And a lot of people, I think, are trying to find ways now to get Dominique on the 75 team. Were there guys that you thought that were legitimately snubbed? And when I say legitimately snubbed, I mean it's not just the usual complaint, but like, no, this was a mistake. These guys should have been on.
Yeah. Dominique, and it's interesting what Steiny said, Howard, because we all try to get rid of, and I think in general, one of the things that one of the few things we do pretty well is vote on these things. We take it very seriously. Every year there's an MVP vote. Oh, you're just like him because he, we try to get rid of that stuff and we call up other people and we try to do that correctly because it seems important. However, as I always say, we have these little things inside of us that talk to us, and there are a little biases, prejudices. I'm not even going to call them that, likes and dislikes. And I hear Bob McAdoo whispering to Steiny. And for me, Dominique, when I was covering the league, I just loved Neek. I just loved him. And I used to, I knew him in college. I did a story on him in college, and I remember his great game in Boston Garden. So these things stick with you. So when it comes down to should somebody or shouldn't they, maybe this little personal thing, does a nudge. We can't get out of that. And for me, one of the things I remember was Dominique. That is one of the guys that I remember that we left off. I didn't remember McAdoo until, I don't remember arguing about it until 3 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago. Peter Vesey has a tweet about, God damn it, I'm putting McAdoo on there now. And I started going back to my records and seeing that, yeah, he's one of those guys too. But the one I remember for me is Dominique. And the other argument I remember, which I'm sure you want to talk about, was Shaq in the league long enough to get on the list? And that is a big thing that we had to deal with right now. And I'm sure the Jokic-Doncic argument, which I'm sure maybe you want to get to later.
All right. So, but to answer the question, looking back, you think Dominique should have been on? And I mean, again, we're not revealing our ballots, but like he's getting serious consideration, I would assume, for you this time, if you feel like that was somebody who should have been there the first time.
From me, he is. But for me, he is. But I always remember the people every year, and this came up with the Dream Team, since somebody always comes up. Well, what are you, crazy? Worthy, Isaiah, and Dumars should have all been on a Dream Team. I go, okay, beside Leitner, who you want to kick off? Who do you want? David Robinson? You want to get rid of David Robinson? You want to get rid of Mullen? Who do you want to get rid of? So when people start griping about who's not on, I say that is great. That's why we do these lists. Just tell me who to take off. Just tell me who to take off.
And some of that, and some of that, the best advice I got from some folks who I talked to about doing this while I'm wrestling with this, because it is torturous, it's hard, it's fun, but it's really hard, is at a certain, like there's a huge group of players we're all going to probably agree on, maybe even 60 or 70, maybe not 70. Let's say 60 out of the 75. And then the last 10 to 15 or whatever are going to be a lot of personal preference. Not personal bias, but just, I value this player and what he brought to the league more than this other player. And a different voter is going to say, no, but you're overlooking that this guy invented this one move or dominated this one 5-year span or whatever. And we're trying to assess the totality of their careers, their individual dominance, and also, this is one of the phrases I always use about MVP every year. Individual dominance, team success. There's some weird sliding scale that is in my head that I cannot define, but you're trying to combine these things. And you see that. I noted that most of these guys, like every MVP except for McAdoo, had made the top 50 list. A lot of champions are on the top 50 list. Dominique is a guy who I assume, I don't know how every voter decided this back in 1996, but a lot of people probably left off Dominique for lack of postseason success leading his teams anywhere. And that is something we'll have to wrestle with a number of guys. But I just think that if you finish your career in the top 20, top 25 scorers of all time, no matter what your other deficiencies might have been as a player, defensively, as a passer, whatever, you were great. Like Carmelo, I'm going to say it right off. I have no problem putting Carmelo on, even though I've been one who's been critical of some of the gaps in his game. Dude's one of the greatest scorers we've ever seen. He's never been to the finals, no. Won conference finals. His resume isn't great when it comes to team success, but dude's one of the greatest scorers we've ever seen.
Right.
How do you leave him off, right?
No,
so
I
don't have
agree
a problem with that.
Carmelo's one of those guys, sort of a Dominique type of player. Those guys are usually, they're a scorer. They probably shoot too much. They didn't win a title. And did they make everybody better? Those are the type of guys, and Dominique certainly fell into that category. You're right about Melo. I'm going, geez, I don't know. I mean, and then I look at his numbers. The name of this game is to score. And we all have our, like, the little category that is my little is longevity. If I'm going to try to move somebody ahead of somebody else, and that spoke a little bit to what somebody I took off the top 50. How long did they do this? Melo's been doing this a long time, and some of the other guys, okay, well, they didn't have, they got a knee injury and they didn't get back, and that cut their career to 11 years instead of 18 years. And they would have been better if they, the Bernard King thing. I'm going, you're right, but what can I tell you?
Right.
This guy played 19 years and averaged, 18 and 9, and this guy only played 11 years. So I like the guy that played 18 years. That's just me, Yeah,
fate intervenes, right? Like you can, it's the same what if with their careers. Like, well, if Tracy McGrady doesn't get hurt, if Grant Hill doesn't get hurt, if Penny Hardaway doesn't get hurt, and you think, yeah, they would have had these phenomenal careers. Maybe they would have won championships too, but we can't extrapolate and say, well, now that makes you an all-time great. Like, those are three guys who are on my list of considerations who I nevertheless will have a really hard time pushing onto the final list because they weren't great long enough. There are guys who didn't get hurt or didn't have catastrophic injuries who still only had maybe a 3 to 5 year span of being dominant. And then you still say, well, okay, you stuck around for 10 or 12 years, but if you were only dominant for 5, is that enough to overwhelm a guy like Carmelo, who has the longevity, and some others who stuck around? There's the Yao Ming question. It's a very short span in terms of his NBA career. And this is an NBA 75th anniversary team. It's not like the Basketball Hall of Fame where you're considering the totality of a guy's career. No. This one's NBA specific.
You brought up Yao, and I want to bring up, I think I can mention his name, the great Brian Mcintyre, the great public relations guy. Brian and I have been trading some notes, and Brian, I didn't re-look this up. Maybe you know this. Brian said that Yao Ming played 100 more games than Bill Walton. And that,
I'm gonna look this up to verify. I have no doubt that McIntyre's right, but I'm gonna look up while we're talking.
That blew my mind, and I'm going, automatically I put, I love Bill, and you'll never convince me Bill isn't one of the top 50, 30 players. But is college in our mind a little bit? The one year when he came, he won in 77, then he comes back with the Celtics, and that was the first team I covered. And I love that team and what Bill did. He helped win him a championship. But it's an example of how you can make certain assumptions. And my assumption was Yao didn't play nearly enough games to make this list, despite what he added to the game. That he really added this dimension of, it already been an international game. What Yao did was, don't have time to get into that. But I would have liked to have really thought about Yao Ming. And once again, not to divulge anything, but he was one of those guys that I thought probably didn't play enough.
So because I was curious, I had to look it up. So Bill Walton's total career, 468 regular season games. I did not count playoffs. 468 games for Bill Walton, 486 for Yao. So it was only an 18-game difference, at least in regular season games. But Bill Walton's role, with the Celtics and winning championship there, like Walton gets enhanced partially by the era he's in and partially by teams he was with that he was an important player on. And Yao
he was
doesn't
the best
have
player in 1977 when they won. He was the best player in the league. He was the best player there was. He had a time when he was that. I don't think Yao did. Yeah. Yao also, never had a time when he was the best player in the world.
Plus, games played metric notwithstanding, Bill Walton is the 1978 MVP of the regular season. He's the 1977 Finals MVP. He's got a Sixth Man of the Year award.
Sure.
He wins 2 championships. So again, individual success, team success. We're weighing all these things, and Yao, for his dominance in his very short NBA career, which lasted basically only 8 years, Bill Walton's career also truncated because of health, but he's part of these historic teams, and he's won MVP, and that puts you on another level. And so I think
no
that's
doubt
fair.
about it. I didn't have any trouble with it. I'm just saying this was among the things you have to consider when you do this. You could spend, and plus the fact, Howard, that when we did it the first time, the first ancient 50 voters back in 1996, analytics played. There was barely the internet. So we weren't. I didn't get into. Maybe you and Zach were there trading, player values and stuff, but I didn't do that. I mean, these guys were kind of like the eye test to me. And all of the 50, by the way, I saw them play. I mean, I wasn't covering the league, but I saw Dolph Jays play. And some of this a little bit is the eye test, and that figures into it a little bit.
Worth pointing out for really younger listeners, in 1996, very little of the internet was built out. There was no Basketball Reference. There was no PER. There were no win shares. There was no such thing as effective field goal percentage or true shooting percentage. There was no pace metric, even though some teams and coaches did track pace. We were not doing things on a per possession basis, although Del Harris once pointed out to me that he had an early book that he'd written in like the 70s, I think, where he had adjusted things on a per 100 basis or something and said we need to look at the game this way for purposes of evaluating. So anyway, none of this stuff was publicly available or disseminated or discussed in 1996. So you guys were dealing with, to an extent, to an advantage, a much smaller set of data. So you couldn't just talk yourself in circles for days on end with the same extent. All right, so let's hit Shaq real quick though. He only had played 4 years, and he makes that team. I'm not covering the NBA yet in 1996, and I remember just as a sports fan, as a just general viewer, thinking like, the NBA force-fed Shaq onto this. I didn't know there was a voting panel that included individual independent media members like yourself. I like a lot of people, I cynically thought that the NBA did this because they wanted a current player to be on there for publicity purposes, marketing, whatever. Should Shaq have made it in 96? Because with 4 years of experience, that does get us into, as you alluded to, well, then what do we do with Luka Doncic and Nikola Jokic, who would end up being potentially one of the only MVPs not to make it if he doesn't make it on there?
But they'll make the 100. But they'll make the 100 team.
Yes, they will make the 100, almost certainly, unless they have a terrible injury, right?
Yeah, I think, Howard, if I can't exactly remember, but I think that I said yes to Shaq for the reason that I alluded to earlier. This idea that people say, and you were a young fan then going, well, the NBA, I've been doing this for, at SI since the 80s. I don't give a crap what the NBA thinks. I really don't, about marketing and all that stuff. But I remember thinking, and I alluded to it in the beginning, that there has to be some tip of the hat to current fans. And there has to be a little bit of a buzz. And David Stern didn't get on with me and go, I think we should push Shaq. So that just doesn't happen. And this. That doesn't happen the way people think that it happens. But I thought, is Shaq going to be, of course he is going to be this incredible, dominant, almost cartoonishly dominant force. So let's go with him. And I remember that being my decision. Having said that, Did I stay consistent and say Jokic and Doncic? Maybe I came to it. But yeah, what is the magic number? I mean, let's go to Giannis. What's the magic number?
All right, well, okay, so since you brought it up, Giannis has been in the league for, I believe, 8 years now.
8 years.
He's a two-time MVP.
And he won a
Finals MVP.
Yeah, put him in. Write him in.
So, right. That's a lot easier. I'm just double checking the math here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, 8 years in. 8 years is that's a career for some guys. Like, that's Yao's career is 8 years. So Giannis, I have no problem because of everything he's already achieved and as dominant as he is and as dominant as we can expect him to be. Doncic, Jokic, Embiid, too soon. Guys, get back to me in 2046 if I'm lucky enough to still be around.
One thing's for sure, I'm not on that committee. By the way, I won't be on that committee. I don't think.
I don't think I'm going to be. I don't think I'm going to be either, Jack. So there's that. A couple other curiosities with the top 50 before we move on to some of the quandaries for the top 75. I don't mean to pick on the Knicks, but the Knicks won 2 championships in the early 1970s, and they've got 4 guys on the top 50 team, whereas the 1990s Bulls, who won 6 championships, only have 2 guys. The Celtics, who won all of the championships in the early years of the NBA, they have 5 guys. And so, like, when you're putting on Russell, Cousy, Havlicek, Sharman, Sam Jones, like, I kind of get that the Celtics dominated the first era of the NBA. The Knicks won 2 titles over a few years in the early 70s, and they have 4 guys on the top 50 team, and it doesn't necessarily seem, on further reflection 25 years later, like that made sense, but it probably made more sense at the time. There were probably obviously fewer names. Those Knicks teams were obviously legendary, and those 4 players, individually, have something to say for that too. It's not just the titles, I understand. So, but that's Willis, Reed, DeBusschere, Frazier, and Monroe, obviously. So, just a quick thought on how the Knicks have 4 with only 2 championships.
But 2 things about that, Howard. You're absolutely right. I'll get back to the Knicks. But the weird thing about the Celtics is that one of the guys that I felt bad getting overlooked, and I believe it's another one that Peter Vesey mentioned, is Hindson. Hindson was a monster. Tommy Hindson. But I mean, how many guys can you have? I went back and looked at the Knicks thing, and I think people, maybe including myself, were taken by the mystique of the Knicks. And you could argue, great as they were, Dave DeBusschere, if I wanted to pick somebody and say, yeah, I want Dave with me in the battle lines, but you could argue that he wouldn't be on that top 50 team. And that is one of the debates I had on my head. I think he was only a 12-year guy. But yet at the same time, somebody might say that about Earl, Monroe. And I'd go, oh man, Earl the Pearl Monroe, he's got to be on that team. I don't give a damn. So am I taken by the mystique of the Pearl, since this is a non-statistical, we're not putting these in any kind of metric. Are we just giving it the eye and the aesthetic test? Maybe, but you were correct to point out that the 2 guys to me that are really clear on that team are Willis and Frazier. And that you could have a decent argument about DeBusschere and Monroe.
I mean, I'll take it a step further. The Showtime Lakers are legendary and won a lot more championships than those Knicks teams did. But I'm still not sure that James Worthy should have been on that list along with Magic and Kareem. He was, a vital third star there, but Worthy's one of those guys who, when you start playing the game of like, all right, he's part of these historic teams, these championship teams, he's part of a dynasty, but how vital to that dynasty was he? And if he were on another team without Magic and Kareem, are we still glorifying his career? I'm not saying I'm tossing him off the list for that reason. I'm not saying I've even made that decision yet, because I haven't as we tape this. But I thought, I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking about whether James Worthy actually deserves to be there. And it's not that whether he deserves to be there. It's whether 25 years later, when we're trying to go through LeBron and Curry and Harden and Westbrook and Carmelo and everybody who's come along since, does Worthy still hold up when I'm piling up all these names?
I remember thinking about Worthy, and did some guys, as we just mentioned, the Knicks, did some guys get dragged along by the wonder and the magnificence of their teams?
Yeah.
And you have to ask that about James, but I remember thinking this, those Laker teams, first of all, they won 5. Yeah. You don't do that with 2 guys. And that offense, when you look at it, was one of the great things in the history of sport. It was so efficient in the half court. Okay, they threw the ball into Kareem. I get it. And they were so efficient going up and down the court that I thought the way they played the game, those Showtime Lakers, is almost underrated. They are unbelievable team. And Worthy was a huge part of that team. And do I remember him streaking down the field, down the court, and stretching out for dunk shots, seemingly from, the foul line off a magic pass. Yeah, I remember that. But I think that hey, that's one of the things that team was so good, and they had to have somebody beside Kareem and Magic, even though they are so incredibly essential.
And I'll answer my own rhetorical question that I threw in there in talking about the Knicks, the Bulls won 6. They're the greatest dynasty of the modern era, and they only had Michael and Scotty. Well, to answer my own question, it was also 2 different editions of the Bulls. Michael, Scotty, and Phil Jackson were the only real holdovers from the first three-peat to the second three-peat. And so, the third best player in the first three-peat was probably Horace Grant, but Horace Grant doesn't really reach that level. He's not even in the Hall of Fame. The second three-peat has Dennis Rodman, who I think in 1996, when you all were voting on this, he had a couple titles already, but did not have the complete resume. I think now that we know the entirety of his career, to me, there's no doubt Dennis Rodman has to be in. So I have no problem with that one. So the Bulls will, in fact, end up with a third. I believe. I can't predict that, obviously. I don't know how the voters are going to go. I got to believe, Jack, that Dennis Rodman ends up on the 75 list, and now the Bulls are properly represented for the 90s as the dynasty that they were, because they'll have a third name on there.
Sure. And I didn't have any trouble with Scotty, and it was an unusual time, and Horace, and to a certain extent Dennis, then in the second iteration of this, did it, defensively. That's what Horace added to that team. That's incredible. And that's not quite enough on your resume. So, yeah, you're right about Rodman.
Yeah. We've talked about this. Without saying that you have made a definitive decision here, because, again, as we tape this, we have not had to file our ballots yet. They're due, I believe, 6 p.m. on Friday night. We're taping this a little bit before that. If we were looking at the top 50, and you're looking back with the benefit of hindsight, but also the pressure of saying there are more than 25 players since then that have to be added, are there a few guys that you think not necessarily are obvious, but upon further reflection makes sense to be the most vulnerable? Are there a handful of names Dolph Schayes is one that comes up. Great in his time, but he also shot 38% as a big man.
But Dolph shot from 30 feet out. You got to remember there were a lot of 38. I think Cousy shot, kind of in the low 30s. But
shooting percentages back then. Yeah, percentages back then in general. This is why it's hard to compare, Jack, because the game back then, defense wasn't the same as it is now. Well, not nearly as sophisticated. There's a lot more shots. There's more rebounds. So rebounding numbers are inflated back then because everybody's shooting a lot more and missing a lot more. And so going with
rebound numbers for centers are inflated because Nate Thurmond, I don't have his stats in front of me, but monster numbers, because centers got all the rebounds. You're right. And I Dolph would be on there. And one of my guys, to show that how fair and incredibly independent I am, one of my favorite players growing up, and I used to go watch him play, was Billy Cunningham. The Kangaroo Kid. Style, the eye test. It was just an amazing player, lefty. But I went back, and Billy had an abbreviated career, left and went to the ABA. Not that should be against him. Then he came back and he was diminished because of injuries. Billy, to me, is certainly on that could go list. And I just love the guy and was probably damaged by a knee injury that would have been fixed, in your orthopedist's office probably, and he would have been, gone on to greatness. All
right, counterpoint. If your nickname is the Kangaroo Kid, you should just make it.
You got to make
There are so few great nicknames anymore. The Kangaroo Kid is phenomenal, especially because it's a kangaroo and kangaroos jump, and this is a game where jumping matters. All right, for the modern era. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, Bill Sharman was a shooting guard on these Celtics teams, and he was a great free throw. I mean, he was one of those first guys you put it. You name 10 guys you want at the line. You got Bird, Barry, Steph Curry, Nash. Bill Sharman's one of those guys that go up to the line. But my God, if you watch them as a shooting guard compared to some of the guys that came along, that you could argue that he got pulled along, that Bill Russell, maybe pulled him along. Even though I watched Sharman play, I thought he was great. But that's an argument. There are some arguments. Somebody said to me, Dave Bing, what did Dave Bing ever do? Well, I watched Dave Bing play, and I wrote his name down immediately on the eye test. Maravich is a guy, Howard, that there was a lot of argument about all style, no substance, et cetera, et cetera. Well, he's Pistol Pete, right? I mean, he's still freaking Pistol Pete. So,
yeah. But
a lot of argument about him, though,
Bill Sharman, by the way, listeners, also invented the shoot-around. So there, you can go look that little piece of trivia up. I met Bill when he was working as a consultant for the Lakers back in my Laker beat days. He's also one of the nicest guys in the league and probably in league history. A total gentleman. If I have to leave him off, I will feel terrible about it.
I did not leave him off. I want to say that. I'm on record as saying I kept Bill Sharman on.
All right. So let's get to the modern era. I mean, look, there are at least 15 guys. I'm not going to name them all, but there are at least 15 in the 96 to the present era that are like absolute locks. Like no one's going to leave off Kobe Bryant or Tim Duncan, LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, Dirk Nowitzki, Dwayne Wade, Kevin Garnett. That's not all 15 that I'm thinking of, but that's like as I read those names, there's not a single person listening to this podcast who could possibly think that those guys won't make it. And there are a few more than a few more after that, I think. And so when you realize how many guys are in the last 25 years are all-time greats, outstanding individually, great team success, championships, MVP awards, ton of all-NBAs and all defensive teams and all this, you can see how quickly this gets difficult. So I just listed a few quandaries here. As I was compiling my list, Jack, of candidates, everybody that I want to make sure I at least thought about, considered, jumped onto their stats page, looked at other reference points. I've consulted Bill Simmons' book of basketball more than a few times in the last couple of weeks because he does such a great job of encompassing the historic compare and contrast of all these guys too. And even though that book's 10 years old, it's still relevant for a lot of these guys. And I certain guys who I could not, or I'm having difficulty elevating on their own, and then some of them I end up saying, oh, wait, but if I do this guy, what about this guy? So here's one of them. This is quandary number one. Ben Wallace, who just was inducted into the Hall of Fame, versus Dikembe Mutombo versus Dwight Howard. And I know Dwight's a controversial figure, but Dwight's going to be in the Hall of Fame, and it's like there's no question about that. I should also quickly note this, folks. The Hall of Fame has somewhere between 110 and 120 NBA players, right? The Hall of Fame is more than just the NBA, it's basketball. But there's like 120, 110, somewhere in there, Hall of Fame NBA players. And this is a top 75 list, which means automatically we're leaving out 40, 50 Hall of Famers from this list. So it's not that you're not great, it's just that this is a higher level. Ben Wallace versus Dikembe Mutombo versus Dwight Howard. If one go, don't all three have to go? Is that a faulty framework?
I think so. And you brought up an interesting thing. One of my, once again, I'm not going to say biases or prejudices but likes or dislikes is, would you give that guy the ball? I know Ben Wallace you didn't want to play against that guy. He was a bitch. He'd wear you down. He'd kill you. Mutombo would swat away 11 of your shots and change 5 others. But did he have the whole dimension? And Dwight Howard, I can go on record since I've written it, is somebody that I did not love. Do we start this thing? Well, he didn't reach his potential. My God, he could have been so much. Dwight Howard, this is just me, got to be on there. The other 2 do not have to be on there. That's just me. Just not enough. And I always had that argument, Howard, about Rodman, that if you only, if your emphasis is just guarding somebody, but Rodman was such an amazing defender who could defend 5 people, and he rebounded his butt off. You still didn't isolate for him, but to me, he's an easier case than Ben or Dikembe. And Dwight Howard, just on the basis of that guy had some monster stuff going on, early in his career, 38 and 18, he had those 1950 centers type of numbers. So that's where I would go there. But it's a legit question, no doubt about it.
And it's tough. And listen, I know some people are going to compare Ben Wallace was considered kind of a version of a modern day Dennis Rodman type. But the reason Rodman to me is a no-brainer and Ben Wallace is not a no-brainer, he's a consideration, but I'm not sure, it's championships, right? Like Rodman, not only is he a part of that Bulls dynasty and absolutely the key third player after Scottie and Michael, but he was also a champion before in Detroit. He's a 5-time NBA champion. He was a key part of the Bad Boys teams too, and not as important in that pecking order as with the Bulls, but 8-time All Defensive player Dennis Rodman,
Sure.
7-time rebounding champion, 5-time NBA champion, and so if your contributions also led to championships, like it does, it elevates you. That puts him over Ben Wallace, whose prime was a lot shorter. Ben Wallace has this really weird career arc. I've talked about this before, where he's nobody, he's undrafted, he bounces around for a few years. Suddenly, out of nowhere, he becomes this supreme defender, rebounder, shot blocker, everything else, and is part of this Pistons team that was really an ensemble cast. It wasn't like a team of superstars. It was an ensemble. And they go to 2 finals and they win a championship. He was great during that span, but it was a very short span. And so that the lack of longevity of his greatness matters to me too.
Yeah.
Dikembe, though, like it's hard to overlook Dikembe. 8-time All-Star, 6-time All-Defense, 4-time Defensive Player of the Year, tied with Ben Wallace for most all-time in that category. Dikembe was a 2-time rebounding champion, 3-time block champion. He's 20th all-time in rebounds. He's 2nd all-time in blocks, but only won finals, no championship. It's hard. And then you mentioned, that Dwight to you is the best of that group. Makes 2 finals, wins 1 championship, and his championship is as a 12-minute per game player off the bench for the Lakers.
Yeah, I didn't count in his championship.
Yeah, yeah.
He was a dominant player. To me, was Dikembe at both ends of the floor ever the dump? Believe me, this is hard for me arguing cheerleading Dwight Howard. This is give me a D. This is not easy for me, but I'm just arguing it. But if Dikembe Mutombo makes it, I will say fine. That's okay. We have reasonable people who have different opinions, and Dikembe's certainly in the conversation. To me, Ben, and I don't want to say this in front of him, but really isn't. Was he the best player? I always thought Chauncey was the best player on those Piston teams. So
he's still waiting for his Hall call.
Yeah, I'm not saying it to his face. I'm saying it on your podcast. But
and it'll be interesting to see if Chauncey makes it. By the way, quick footnote: we used to talk about the Pistons as the only champion, I think, of all time. that had no Hall of Famers on it, and that was part of their distinction. They've actually lost a little of their distinction. The fun part of that team was it was this ensemble cast of a bunch of guys who never got their due, who weren't superstars, and no Hall of Famers. The only champion with no Hall of Famers. Well, they've got one now, and maybe Chauncey eventually gets there too. We'll see. So next quandary, the truncated careers category, right? We've got Grant Hill, Tracy McGrady, Penny, Yao Ming, all of them incredible for stretches. And, T-Max, even his run of dominance was almost long enough to qualify. But then again, he's got this saddle of never let his teams out of the first round. I just they're all guys who were incredible to watch and dominant figures. But I'm having a hard time given the sheer number of candidates. I'm not sure I can get those guys on.
Well, I went eye test on a couple of those guys. First of all, Grant, you're right. That is the question. I don't have it in front of me. I didn't do that much preparation. Excuse me. Grant went longer and further than I thought. I will say that. I kept thinking, man, you got a guy who's basically 4 or 5 years was damaged. And so Grant probably to me, would be a strong candidate. McGrady, we get into this somewhat of the Dwight Howard argument. Well, he just think what he could have been. Well, for 3 or 4 years, that guy was the best player in the league. You could certainly argue that he was a dominant guy. And if somebody said that's not enough, I would say point taken. But to me, neither of them were easy. You named 4 guys there. None of them was easy. But I guess you can tell the way I'm talking, the way that I kind of voted on those guys. McGrady was just an amazing talent in a league that values talent and promotes it, and we want to see it. That was the McGrady test for me.
Yeah. I mean, look, Tracy McGrady. People go look up his YouTube highlights. Dude was a killer, and he could. And by the way, we talk about this era of unicorns, or as I call them, some of these guys I think are just like mutants, right? These big, forward types who have ball handling skills. All this is Magic Johnson was one of a kind back in his time. Now we've got, LeBron and Giannis and Ben Simmons and all these guys, Kevin Durant, all these guys who are like guys who have been forwards, or even in Durant's case, center by height alone at a certain time in the NBA's history, but who are multi-skilled, incredible from every area on the court. And McGrady at 6'8" back then, he would be perfect in today's NBA. Yeah. And he would get I think we talked about the usage rate, again, a metric that did not exist in 1996. Guys are just given the ball now. James Harden, you're our best player, just use 35% of all our possessions. That didn't happen back then, but if McGrady had gotten that kind of license, the numbers he could have put up. All right, so then there's this quandary of whether how much longevity matters and the stats you accrue over time. Vince Carter is 19th all time in points, 25,000 point club, pretty elite. Dominant early part of his career, great mentor back half of his career. Respect the fact he stuck around into his early 40s and was willing to become a role player. He was elite for a good 10-year stretch, but he didn't win anything in that 10-year stretch. His numbers were off the charts, but he didn't win anything. And then there's a few other guys who, Chris Webber I've advocated for him to be in the Hall of Fame. I'm glad he made it. He was dynamic. He was evolutionary. The way he played at power forward was unique at the time. The number of things he did with the ball, the areas he played on the court, but he didn't win. I even throw Reggie Miller in this category in a way. Reggie Miller accrues a lot of stats over a long career, and he paves the way in some ways for maybe the three-point era. He's by far the greatest three-point shooter of his time, but he didn't win. So these are 3 guys who don't have championships to back up their resumes, weren't on all-time great teams necessarily, have great stats, but for one reason or another, it's not a full resume. I think Reggie Miller's probably going to make it automatically just because of what he represented at that time. And I'm not sure about the other two, but they're all guys that I wrestle with a little bit.
Yeah, well, sounds like we had the same arguments, the same internal discussions in our head, and they don't want you trading information necessarily. When you get the ballot, they don't say don't do this, but I think it helps to talk through to some people. For example, I went through the ballot the first time quickly, just stupidly. I had not put, Julius Erving on it. I had not transformed to, so I think it helps to talk to people. And it sounds like those of us who followed the game had these same discussions. And once again, more than people would like, you have what I just call this ineffable determination of this guy, not that guy. Reggie was one of those guys. Is Reggie better than Vince Carter? Probably not. Although, Vince is one of those guys that ineffable reasons, just for the all-time dunk, you could have on there. But, when you don't go to a statistical model and you're just kind of saying what stirs you inside and what about him, Reggie was a stirring player to me. The stuff in the Garden, what you said about paving the way, the game now is so completely different. We don't have any time to get into that. I don't even think people can understand how different that it is. But Reggie Miller, to Steph Curry, there's a line there. And I know you're running out of time, but one of the guys that comes into that is Damien Lillard, who probably has played enough seasons, sort of like he played a Giannis number of seasons, probably will never win an MVP, but is one of those revolutionary guys that fit into the revolutionary mode of the game. And he was another one you had to wrestle with from this era. And if you left him off the team, and let's say I did, that just shows you how tough this exercise, really was.
I mean, Reggie was the greatest three-point shooter in the league for over a decade, at a time when that was not a universal tool in the toolbox. He was just so far ahead of everybody else. That's like Ray Allen. Like, Ray Allen comes along later. They overlap a bit, but Ray Allen comes along Ray Allen between 1996, I looked this up, between 1996 and 2014, 96 is when he's drafted, of course, Ray Allen had 1,000 more threes than anybody else in the league over that span.
And is his championship moments coming into your head a little bit? For me, yes, that it did. The shot from the court comes into my head. I like Ray Allen.
And I think some people want to leave Ray Allen off because, he's only the third most important player on those Celtics teams that make a couple finals and win one championship. He has this iconic all-time shot for the Heat. He's a role player, right? He's their Robert Horry, essentially, at that point. But that diminishes what Ray Allen already was over the course of his entire career, the totality of his career, where he had been a leading man, a number two, whatever. Because there's that discussion too, Jack. Like, this is another one of those quandaries, is that, you've got Chris Bosh as third wheel on two title teams and a four-time final. Like, the Heat go to 4 straight finals, which, again, in the modern era, that didn't used to be routine. The Heat going to 4 straight finals, obviously this is followed then by the Cavs going to 4 straight and the Warriors going to 5 straight. But for a long time, even those Shaq and Kobe Laker teams, all those Spurs teams, nobody went to 4 straight finals. Bosh is a really key and important and evolutionary type player on those Heat teams, but he's like the third wheel. Pau Gasol, great statistical career in Memphis, but nothing to show for it. Goes to the Lakers and is Kobe's number 2, and now wins a couple championships, but he's a number 2. So, weighing these number 2s, number 3s. Manu Ginobili is another one. Number 2, number 3, wherever you want to put him on the Spurs pecking order. So there's that one too. Like, it's kind of back to the James Worthy argument, I guess.
Yeah, that Celtic team is tough because I tell you what was a wrestling match is Paul Pierce. I mean, Kevin, you look at Garnett's career. Kevin Garnett he's I think he's going to go down as underrated. That guy was just an amazing player, and that Celtics team. And Paul Pierce was, to me, one of the ones you kind of, missed a lot of shots, played, maybe, toward the end, had some, wasn't what he was. But he's another tough wrestle with. And there's a lot of those type of guys, if you say, well, he was never the big dog. Of course, if you ask Paul, oh, I was the big dog. I was the guy, I was the guy.
Well, he was, for the first half of his career, he was more of the Vince Carter type, right? Or Carmelo Anthony, somebody who was best player on his team by far, most talented, put up the biggest numbers, got the most shots, didn't have much to show for it. And then Paul Pierce, the back half of his career, we completely recast the way we view him, because they do go to a couple finals once they get Garnett and Ray Allen, and they do win a championship, and Paul Pierce is the MVP of that finals. Like, I can't, like, that, to me, that weighs a lot. Like, if you had, on the first half of your career, all the individual accolades, but none of the team success, and then you got the team success later by taking a step back, and your finals MVP, like, I have a really hard time not putting Pierce on there.
Sure.
But it's not, but it's not automatic,
Yeah, not automatic, no.
Chauncey Billups is finals MVP, as we mentioned. Derrick Rose is a regular season MVP, but then the injuries tear him down. So, like, there's another two guys who, like, their careers are just a little funky, though they meant a lot in that moment. And it goes back to something you said about just, like, these ineffable qualities, right? To some extent, it's your impact on the game, on the era, cultural cachet. Russell Westbrook, not a lot to show for all of his pyrotechnics, but boy, the pyrotechnics.
Yeah, I mean, you can't have it. We talked about Russell Westbrook for 300 days out of that season pursuing Oscar Robertson. You can't not have a guy with those kind of numbers on your team. Harden, well, what did he ever? He goes in the finals and he misses 16 threes. And, well, he changed, he's a revolutionary kind of, not always the correct way, but he's a revolutionary type of player. How about, we could do this all day, but what about, I wrestled with, actually I didn't wrestle too much. I love him, but Tony Parker. Who's better, Tony Parker or Ginobili? Or would they have neither of them been as good without Duncan? Well, to me, that was a clear thing that both of those guys would have been good. Like, Duncan didn't make them, the way that I looked at those guys. Duncan, like maybe some other 3-point shooter type was that. But somebody else I talked to go, Ginobili, he was just kind of exciting. I don't think he belongs on here. To me, he was kind of a lock, but that's just me.
Yeah, I mean, Parker and Ginobili as a backcourt tandem, if you had just put them on any other team back then, would have been a really, really good team. And, Ginobili played both ends, and he could ball handle as a shooting guard. In fact, sometimes they just put the ball in his hands instead of Tony Parker's hands.
They always did. When they went to isolation, clock running down, Ginobili always, I remember asking him about that. Ginobili, as good as Parker was, he led the league in points in the paint one year. They put Ginobili out there, to run kind of the 1-4. But, I'm making my Ginobili argument. But anyway.
Well, but also, look, we've got the Spurs win 5 titles, right? They're this weird prolonged dynasty where it's 5 championships spread over a decade and a half. And Duncan and Robinson, Robinson's in, Duncan absolutely will be, but Robinson was only, there for the early part, and the back half is you've got Kawhi, who probably is going to make it. You've got Parker and Ginobili, who might get overlooked, but other dynasties that we've discussed on this podcast have multiple guys. I'm not sure if either of those two are going to have done enough individually to make it, but they'll be on some ballots. I have no doubt about that.
Yeah.
So the listeners can now grasp just how difficult this is, because Jack and I have been at this now for an hour, and we could probably go for another 3, and we will still not come up with any conclusions that we feel really good about. We're still going to feel terrible about a bunch of guys that we leave off. And this has been the exercise. Like, it's fun, but it is torture. thank you for joining the torture with me and commiserating for a bit here, Jack. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. One final thing, Howard. These kind of lists, which we agonize over and try to do well, it's the kind of thing that makes sports. And I did my top 100 years ago for SI, and there is a guy out there somewhere in internet land who would still hunt my ass down because I had Kobe too low. So people take these things, if we take it really seriously as a voter, and I don't think people realize that we do, there are people that take it really seriously. So I'm sure you know this from naming top lists. Nothing gets people fired up more than how the F could you leave this guy off? Nothing fires it up. And that's why we all have jobs in sports for stuff like this. You know?
Well, and on that note, thank God we don't have to rank the 75. We just have to submit 75 names. They do not have to be in any particular order. If they did, I would have just collapsed by now. Yeah. Jack, this has been great, man. Thank you so much for spending the time. Appreciate it. Good luck finishing your ballot. I need luck finishing mine. Hopefully I get it in on time.
Great talking to you, Howard.